male and female in distinct ways for distinct purposes, that there is glory in a man living before God as a man. There's glory in a woman living before God as a woman according to his design. We've looked at many passages of Scripture about that. One of the key texts in the New Testament is 1 Corinthians 11, verses 2 through 16. I would say it would be one of the more controversial passages in the New Testament. One of the passages that strikes us as the most kind of foreign and strange when we first read it. Let me get it before us now. I'll just read all of it, and then we'll dig into it together, because I do think there's a lot of practical value here. Paul says, "Now I commend you," in verse 2, "I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. Judge for yourselves, is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God." Raise a show of hands. How many people have ever heard this passage preached on or taught on in church before? Paul grew up on a steady diet of head coverings and haircuts. Anybody over here on this side? Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Okay. But a relatively low percentage of us have really dug into 1 Corinthians 11. I think that's fair to say. Have you ever encountered this passage, maybe not in a sermon at the church that you attended, but what does this passage make you think of? Where have you run into it before, if you have? In the early 70s, it was a big deal. I actually have a microphone tonight. Would you?
I just said it. In the early 70s, all of this was a big deal.
Please tell me more about it. Come on. And they won't be able to hear you if you don't talk into the mic.
There's not much to tell. Let me put it this way. In the late 60s, early 70s, it was a big topic of discussion in Baptist churches. Other denominations, frankly, not so much.
Okay.
But in Baptist churches, it was a very big issue. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you an incident.
I knew you'd have one. Why did you act like you didn't have an incident?
Well, I was playing in a rock and roll band, as you might suspect. But anyway, the drummer, one night, he had loaned a piece of equipment to a guy that was going to a Baptist church. I won't mention the name of it, in Memphis. I guess they're still in business. But anyway, so we said, well, it was Wednesday night, as a matter of fact. And we said, okay, well, we knew this guy was in church. Now, I mean, they knew he was. I didn't really know one way or the other. But this fellow was in the Wednesday night service, and we said, well, let's just run by there and pick up your thing that you need, and then we'll be all right. There was some tall steps going up to that church, and our friend had long hair, as did everybody I knew at that time. But he had long hair, and so he started up the steps, and when he got up to the top of the steps, he was met by two deacons of that church, and one got on one arm, one on the other, lifted the guy up, carried him down the steps, and told him, "We don't let long-haired people like you in this church." And that left a bad impression on all of us.
All parties concerned.
But that was not an uncommon thing to happen.
That's great. Bob's the long-haired deacon first. That's his deacon job here at church. He expels long-haired young men. Anybody else have a story? 1 Corinthians 11? Where have you run into this passage before? Have you heard it quoted? Is it like something that gets hashed out around the lunch table kind of thing? No? How many people would say, "I've never heard this in my life"? That's not the kind of thing we like to own up to in church. It's okay. There are a lot of passages like that for all of us. It is a passage that I think strikes us as rather strange when we first read it, especially when Paul throws in references to angels. And there's just many things here where we ask ourselves, what's really going on in this instruction to the church? Well, if you know anything about 1 Corinthians, Paul takes on all kinds of problems in this letter. Some of the problems that he addresses are problems that they know they have. And so they've sent Paul with a list. Could you please explain this to us? Could you answer these questions? And so Paul kind of works through their list. But then there's a whole list of things, a whole list of problems they don't know that they have, but Paul knows they do. And he says, "While I've got your ear, let me tell you about these things too." And so Paul's working through all these issues with the Corinthian church. The city of Corinth, as we're going to talk about, which is just a notoriously immoral, worldly environment. And here's this little group of men and women who've been saved out of that. They've heard the message about Jesus. They've responded to it with repentance and faith. They're now trying to walk with Jesus in this new way. But there's still a lot of that Corinth mixed in with the way that they think and the way that they talk and the way that they just relate to one another. And so Paul is very patiently working through these discipleship issues with really a very messy group of Christian believers, and we benefit from it. We benefit from the messiness of the Corinthian church because we get all this rich instruction from Paul about all kinds of different issues. We just didn't know we needed help dealing with the issue of head coverings, and that's that first blank. The problem that Paul takes on here involves, of all things, head coverings. As I said, it seems very foreign to us, but while details in the passage are a little bit confusing, I think the main point by the time we get to the end is going to be pretty clear. The main point is clear. So the Corinthians had been redeemed out of an environment, not just of worldliness in general, but of sexual disorder and sexual immorality in particular. Now, the ancient Roman world was not known for this high level of moral rectitude. It was kind of a bawdy, raunchy place just in general. But in the Roman world, Corinth was notorious for being more immoral than anybody else. It was a seaport town. There's lots of people coming in and out of the harbor. Lots of influences from around the world are kind of pulling up right there in that city. And there was a phrase at that time, to act like a Corinthian. To act like a Corinthian, that just means to be buck wild, to have no standards, to be completely immoral, completely debauched. Like even Romans would say, "Hey, you need to get it together. You're acting like a Corinthian." That's not how Christians wouldn't say that. Just pagan Romans would say that. So it had this very bad reputation. One reason for that is they had the temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of erotic love. Her temple was there in the center of the city. You can imagine, you wouldn't want to send your kid to VBS there. There would be, 1,000 cult prostitutes on the payroll at the temple of Aphrodite, and the way that you would offer sacrifices to this goddess is by having relations with these various prostitutes. Many of those temple prostitutes would shave their heads, by the way, which I think factors in to this passage. So within that very kind of rough milieu, Paul wants this church and their worship gatherings to stand out. right? The way that they conduct themselves, the way they present themselves, the way they relate to one another as men and women, it needs to look different than the surrounding culture in the city of Corinth. And it starts here in verses 2 and 3. Before Paul talks about how to adorn one's physical head, it's the first blank there. Before Paul talks about how to adorn one's physical head, he talks about headship in the sense of authority. And Paul uses that word head throughout this passage in two different ways. It's kind of a play on words that would have made more sense if we were reading it in Greek. But he's talking about your physical head, like that's got hair on it or doesn't have hair on it, either way. But that kind of head, but then also head in the sense of authority, like the head of the organization or the head of the household, that sort of thing. And here in verses 2 and 3, verse 3 actually, Paul says, but I want you to understand that the head of every man, now here he's not talking about your physical head, he's talking about the authority. The authority of every man is Christ. The head of a wife is her husband. So it doesn't say the head of every woman is every man she happens to run into. No, the head of a wife is her husband. He's taking responsibility for leading her, caring for her, and so forth. And the head of Christ is God. So it's this discussion of this order with which God has established the world. So Paul's whole discussion in this passage about how men and women dress, how they arrange their hair, what they do in public worship, all of it rests on this principle in verse 3, that God has established his world with a certain order. There is an order to God's world. The head of a man is Christ. Right? So every man takes his orders from Jesus Christ. That's who he is looking to. That's who he is following. That's who he is answering to. He's seeking to obey Jesus Christ. The head of a woman is her husband, not just any man that she runs into, but this man she's made a covenant relationship with. Right? So we see this symbolized in a wedding ceremony. There's all kinds of symbolism going on in weddings that we don't always take the time to think through. But in a typical situation, especially if homes are intact and all that, you've got the symbol of the father walking down the center aisle with his daughter, and then doing what when he gets to the front of the room? What does he do? He gives her away. The pastor, the officiant says, who gives this woman to be married to this man? He'll say, I do, or her mother and I do, or whatever. And usually there's a lot of joking around, like, I'm not sure if I do it. All this. But then what does that dad do in that ceremony? He cries and throws a fit. That's exactly right. Besides that, what does he do? He takes the daughter's hand out of his hand and puts it in the hand of this other man, this husband. That's a really powerful symbol that even in our 2025 culture that's trying to do away with all these traditional values and principles still holds on to that. The idea is that this dad, imperfectly, but let's say it's a good situation, this dad has cared for this daughter. He's taken responsibility for her. He's provided for her. He's protected her. He's tried to teach her and care for her. And now he's stepping back. He's receding in her life, and he is trusting her to this other man, not to be a tyrant, not to be an ogre, not to be her dictator, nothing like that. But he is taking headship responsibility in her life. He's going to care for her. He's going to lay his life down for her, to love her and provide for her. And she's going to follow him, follow his leadership, not be his doormat, but truly follow him. And there's an exchange that's happening. There's a transition or a transaction. Y'all with me on this? You've seen this on Hallmark? You've seen it in real life? Okay. That's what it's supposed to represent. That's what it's supposed to represent. So the head of every man is Christ. The head of a woman is her husband. The head of Christ is God. That's really interesting that he would throw that in. So verse 3, what I just read, that is about as offensive and as politically incorrect as it gets in the United States. That is as politically incorrect as it gets. That makes me sound like a caveman for even reading it in public. But you can't read the Bible and escape these realities of order and authority. They're just there. It's how God has built his universe. It's how he's built his world. I taught y'all, or I say I taught you, I'm sure you knew the word already, but the first night I talked about the word egalitarianism. Y'all remember that word? Egalitarianism. That means to flatten everything out. There's no distinctions. No distinctions between a man or a woman. They're completely interchangeable. Anything a man could do, a woman can do. I don't just mean like a woman can be as intelligent as a man, but any woman can do any task just in exactly the same way as a man can, and vice versa. So a man can have babies if he wants to. A woman can go do whatever. That's egalitarianism. That is in total defiance of the biblical worldview. It's not egalitarian, and it offends the sensibilities of everyone who's bought into that egalitarian and often feministic worldview, but you can't escape it if you're trying to take the Bible seriously. God has an order to his world that he's created, and that order that he's established does not mean superior to inferior, more valuable to less valuable, smart and competent, pretty but dumb and incompetent. That's not what it means at all. What's one really clear sign in verse 3 that this headship and authority type stuff does not involve superiority and inferiority? There's one really clear sign that it doesn't mean that. It's at the end of the verse. Head of every man is Christ, okay. Okay, so head of every man is Christ. Head of every wife is her husband. The head of Christ is God. So Jesus Christ is inferior to God? Is the Son of God inferior to the Father? No, that's what Arianism teaches, or Jehovah's Witness. That's heresy. Okay, no, Christian teaching, biblical teaching is that the Son is equal to the Father, but the Son is not the same as the Father. The Father's the Father, and there are things that he does that the Son does not do. There are things that the Son does that the Father does not. The Father's the sender. The Son is the sent one. Okay? The Spirit indwells us. Jesus is the one who pours out the Spirit. They all have these different roles within the Trinity, but they're all equal in glory and power and authority. Y'all understand what I'm saying? They're all equal, and yet they have these distinct roles. And apparently, it's not an issue for the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But it's a huge issue for us. And so I think that's a really clear signal that when we get into these discussions about roles and relationships, particularly in marriage or in the church or whatever, difference in responsibility, difference in function does not mean difference in value or difference in equality. So anyway, verses 2 and 3, that's kind of the foundation. Let's move on to verses 4 through 6. That's where it gets a little spicier. Paul now argues that our public worship, so Christians, people who've gotten saved, who now come under the lordship of Jesus, when we get together for worship, our worship should reflect God's design. Okay, so if this is the kind of world that God's made, when Christians get together for worship, we shouldn't be pushing back against that order. We should be reflecting it. We should be embracing it. Does that make sense? It's kind of how the whole passage works. So the context in Corinth is significant, right? And you may have kind of picked up on some of that. You may think could it be that there were things going on in first century Corinth that I just don't understand that are kind of informing what Paul's saying here? Let's look at verse 4 again. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it's the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it's disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. What's he talking about? Well, I think the context in Corinth will help us a little bit. Roman women in the first century, when they would go out in public to show that if they were married, and taken and spoken for, they would wear a head covering of some kind. So if you're going out to the marketplace, you're going shopping, you're going to visit a friend, you're walking through the streets. If you're a married lady, you would wear a head covering. What's something that typically married women wear today to signal that they're married when they're out and about? Typically a wedding ring, right? We still have some kind of visible symbol for marriage. Well, at this time, that head covering was one of those cultural signals. Okay, this is a married woman. As a conspicuous exception to that, so there's one group of women in Corinth who definitely did not wear head coverings. They were not trying to signal that they were a part of a family and following a husband and faithful to him. That's the city's temple prostitutes. They didn't wear, and there were a bunch of them in Corinth, they did not wear a head covering in public. Some of them even shaved their heads. All right, so that's the background here to this instruction in Corinth. Now, just as a side note, this is not what all this is not what this text is about, but in the Old Testament, there are lots of examples of people shaving their heads for legitimate reasons, women shaving their heads for legitimate reasons, often is to express deep mourning or grief. That comes up a lot in the Old Testament. But that's not the situation that Paul's talking about here. So if that's what it's like in Corinth, like in this city at this time, if you're a married lady and you're wanting the world to know it, you're going to wear a head covering when you go out in public. Well, when the Corinthian women were coming together for church, they would stand up to pray aloud in church or to prophesy in church. They're participating in the service. They were casting off their head coverings. That's the next point. They cast off their head coverings. Why would they do that? I don't know all the reasons why they did that. One theme throughout 1 Corinthians is that these Christians in this city, when they get saved and they get filled with the Holy Spirit, it kind of goes to their heads a little bit. They think, Paul will address this several different times, they think that they have entered into the last days to such an extent that by getting saved, by being filled with the Holy Spirit, all their old relationships, all the old order that was a part of their life before Christ has just been dissolved. So that's why in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul's telling Christian spouses, like, y'all don't need to get divorced. You don't need to leave each other just because you've gotten saved. That did not obliterate and eliminate those relationships that were a part of your life before Christ. So they've got these kind of wild ideas, like in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Some of them think that because they're filled with the Spirit, what they do with their body doesn't matter. So some of them were going to visit some of those cult prostitutes and then saying on Sunday when they got together, oh, that wasn't me. Me is the Spirit living inside of me. That was just my body. That body of mine loves to go visit cult prostitutes. And Paul says, it doesn't work like that. That's not what getting the Holy Spirit did for you. That's not what it means to follow Christ. A lot of those old relationships that were a part of God's created order, they continue as a Christian. You're just approaching them in a transformed way with a transformed mind, but they continue. So that's part of what he's dealing with. And so I wonder if, as these ladies come in and they're now filled with the Spirit and they're able to pray and even to give prophecy in these meetings, the gospel has liberated them in a lot of legitimate and wonderful ways. It may be that they think, I don't have to, like my relationship with my husband's been dissolved. I don't have to show in public that I'm connected to him in the same way, that I'm following his leadership, that I'm under his headship, or whatever. It's sending the signal, I'm throwing off that old relationship that I had now that I'm filled with the Spirit and following Christ. Meanwhile, the Corinthian church men were covering their heads to pray and prophesy. So that's what's happening. You get the service, and you know, of course, we don't start at 6:30. We start at 6:40. That's the dirty little secret at Sharon Baptist Church, because nobody's going to be here at 6:30. So we get started at 6:40. It's like, okay, any prophecies this week? And she got a sister over here says, oh, yes, I've got a prophecy. She stands up, tosses that bad boy off, and just starts holding forth, giving that prophecy. And so I'm, okay, thank you very much. And, so she has a seat. And then you got this brother over here says, well, I have a little prophecy to give. And he stands up, and then he puts a head covering on. And this is going on all over the room. You've got women casting off their head coverings, men putting on head coverings in a way that was very much a clash with the cultural expectations for how men behaved and how women behaved, how men presented themselves, how women presented themselves. And it's creating this really confused and chaotic environment. If you were an unbeliever like visiting church that day, you would be shocked by what's happening around you. Now, before we move on, just another one of those little Old Testament side notes. A lot of the times in the Old Testament, men will cover their heads to pray. That's not necessarily an effeminate thing at all times and in all places. There are lots of examples of, the high priest always had his head covered with a turban before he'd go in to pray. Moses wrapped his face in a shawl and a cloak to go out and speak to the Lord on the mountain. So that's not always an effeminate thing, but in Corinth, it was. In Corinth, that's what women do. And so for these men to stand up and put a head covering on their head to talk to God was doing what women do. It'd be like if I got up here and, put on a dress or something. It sent that kind of strong signal. And to Paul, this behavior, women casting off head coverings, men putting head coverings on, this behavior blurs, B-L-U-R-S, blurs important male-female distinctions and leads to disorder in church and home. A man wearing a cover like a woman dishonors his head, Christ. So for me to put some kind of feminine thing, an overtly womanly thing on my head in my culture, that's dishonoring to my relational head, Jesus Christ. What I'm doing with my physical head is dishonoring my relational head. Does that make sense to y'all? Y'all tracking with me on this? Okay. And a married woman removing her covering as if unmarried dishonors her head, her husband. So if Candace were to pray in church tonight and says, hey, before I do that, let me just take this ring and that would be a little concerning. Everyone would be like, man, what's going on? Does following Jesus mean that your marriage relationship is dissolved? That's the kind of confusion that it's creating. So here's Paul's message. The gospel transforms our lives, but it does not erase God's good creation order. Paul wants men and women to both participate in public worship. That's can often be missed in this passage, but he doesn't rebuke women for praying in church. He encourages them to do that, but to do it in a particular way. He wants men and women to both participate in public worship, but they should present and conduct themselves in sexually distinct and in sexually appropriate ways. We'll come back to that. When they come to church, when the Christian men and women of the church at Corinth or wherever, when they come to church, it should be obvious to all that they are men and women and that they are husbands and wives and that they are there to seek God, that they are seeking God. So, sexually distinct ways. What does that mean? Sir? They're identifiable. Androgyny, not cool. I love watching Looney Tunes, but sometimes I have to look at my kids, okay, what Bugs Bunny's doing right now by dressing up as that woman to fool Elmer Fudd, we don't do that. As a matter of fact, I wish he wouldn't do that. I was able to laugh about that as a 7-year-old. Now as an almost 40-year-old, I'm a little disturbed by that. We don't do that. So that confusion of the genders, that's not cool in the Bible. In fact, the Old and the New Testament, God's constantly telling us, if you are a man, you want to lean into your manhood and presenting yourself as a man. You don't want to erase those lines. If you are a woman, you don't want to erase the signs of your womanhood. You want to lean into that and celebrate that for the glory of God, because God made you male and female. He's pleased in those distinctions. So sexually distinct ways, also sexually appropriate ways. Now, one of the things when it comes to this hair stuff later on, another thing those typical prostitutes would do, some would shave their heads, and then some would just have their hair kind of flying wild and wind-tossed. And in that culture at that time, it communicated kind of a seductive kind of a deal. And that's another thing that Paul's saying, we don't want women in the church doing that when they gather for worship. Just have your hair looking like a woman's hair and not sending some sort of signal that you're looking to pick up a man. That's not what we're here to do. We're here to pray, to prophesy, to have our minds on the Lord. So I think there's a lot of freedom for how you're going to fix your hair, but it should be very clear that you're here to pray and you're here to worship. So, we can look at this passage and think, is Paul kind of going overboard? Is this a little bit nitpicky? But there's no escaping it that our public presentation communicates. It communicates. why do all the college game day analysts in college football season, why do they all wear coats and ties? What does that communicate? Professionalism, because even if nothing else in America warrants a coat and tie from a grown man, football does. Sports are that important. When you see a sports analyst, like when was the last time you saw a grown man wearing a coat and tie during the week? They're probably like a lawyer or something. I mean, that is really rare, and I'm not even stumping for that. But when you turn on TV and you see those guys wearing a coat and tie, that's communicating something. What we're talking about really matters. College football or March Madness. It's sending a message. It's sending a signal. What we wear, the way that we present ourselves, it's not unimportant. It really does matter. We want to think about how we're clothing ourselves and presenting ourselves to the Lord. I'm not talking about having a dress code like we should be fancy or not fancy or whatever. I'm just thinking about being thoughtful in the way we present ourselves as people who are just seeking to be mature and seeking the Lord and focused on Him when we gather. I think there's a number of ways that we can do that. We just want to be thoughtful about it. We'll look at verses 7 through 12, two distinct glories. Paul now appeals to the creation account in Genesis 1 through 2 to teach God's distinct designs for men and women. And what he makes clear here is that God did not make men and women at the same time or in the same way or for identical purposes. So what's the order? Who did God make first in the Genesis account? He made Adam first. He made Eve. How did he make Adam? From the dirt, from the dust. Then he breathed into it. How did he make Eve? From Adam. He took Adam's rib out and made a woman out of her. So he made them at different times, in different ways, for different purposes, is what Paul is saying. God made man to be the glory of God. In other words, of all the wonderful things that we can look at in creation that puts God's glory on display, that gives us a little glimpse into the beauty and wisdom and creativity of God, so many magnificent things in creation. But when you see a man submitted to God, living for his glory, being a man, that's what shows off God. A man living in the image of God as God made him to be, as a redeemed, godly man, that shows off the glory of God. If there's anything that makes that glory shine just a little bit brighter, it would be a woman made in the image of God, living as a woman for the glory of God. Because the woman is the glory of the glory. That's what it means when it says the man's the glory of God, woman's the glory of man. It doesn't mean, wow, a man gets to be the glory of God, a woman gets to be the glory of a man. But it's not a downgrade. The man is the most glorious thing that God makes by the sixth day of creation. And then he says, wait, I'm not done yet. And then he makes this woman to be the glory of the glory. She glorifies everything that he does. She adds this new beauty that wasn't there before. All those things that we talked about earlier in this study. But the point here is God made them with distinctive glories. He made them in distinctive ways to give them distinctive glories. God made man from the earth. He made woman from the man. God made man for the earth. He made the woman for the man. At the same time that we're recognizing these distinctions, verses 11 and 12 remind us that men can't exist without women. Look at verse 11. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. And I think this is one of a couple of different ways that Paul's making clear as he outlines the order of church and home and all these things, that men and women, though they have different roles to play, they're interdependent. They completely depend on one another. There wouldn't be any men if there weren't women to bear them and to give them life. So we're all made to depend on one another in very important ways, according to God's order. But in the midst of all that discussion, he brings angels into it in verse 10. Look at what he says. That's why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Now, why do you think Paul brings that up? And I'll open up the floor here. Why do you think he brings up angels all of a sudden? It's a tough verse. You said because they're watching. I think there may be two reasons, and that one's for sure. I think one reason why Paul says because of the angels is because we're told in many places in the New Testament, angels are present when we gather in the name of Jesus. They're present with us. They're watching our worship. They watched God create the world in the beginning. They saw that good, wise order that he established. I don't think Jeremy's trying to cast off the teaching here. He doesn't want none of this. That's for me in my house. I'm going to grow long hair and cast off the head covering. He's going to teach the kids music. So the angels, they saw that good created order. They saw that rightly ordered male and female relationship in the garden. And now when they gather to watch Christian worship, they should see that recovered. They should see men and women learning to function in the way that God made them to, even in a world where there's just total chaos and disorder. The church should be the one place where the angels say, hey, they're getting it. They're getting in line with God's order and God's design. I think there might also be a second reason he brings up angels. Can you think of a story in the Bible that involves men and women behaving badly, angels noticing unattached women getting involved in a rebellious, chaotic kind of a way and bringing disaster on the planet? Does that bring any stories to mind? Genesis chapter 6, right before the ark, right before the flood. It says, in those days, the sons of God noticed the daughters of men, that they were beautiful. They intermarried with them, and that's how you get the Nephilim, these giants. Now, I don't understand everything that's going on in there, but I think there's a good chance that Paul might be doing a callback to that passage, because that was a situation where men and women were not listening to God's design. They're just kind of doing their own thing, being rebellious, being wild. And it invites like spiritual chaos. It's not just relational chaos between men and women on planet Earth. It invites this kind of celestial chaos with the angels getting involved. And it's almost like Paul saying, look, bad things happen when men and women don't listen to God's design for men and women. And so the church should be a place where the peace of Christ is reigning, where there's not chaos, where we're all very happily submitting to God's order and God's design. And so because of the angels looking on, that's what we want them to see. So let's summarize all this head covering stuff. We'll move forward. To summarize, in ancient Corinth, a woman covering her head to pray or prophesy in public worship signaled something. It signaled, first of all, a modesty and propriety. Like, I'm not here to get attention for myself. I'm not here to be seductive or whatever. I'm just here to come before the Lord and pray and worship him. It signaled modesty and propriety, and it signaled submission to her own husband and attachment to her own husband, like wearing a wedding ring. At the same time, for a man to stand and pray with his head uncovered before the Lord signaled his effort to take responsible headship in his home and in the church. Now, I think those details, the specifics of how we signal those things, I think that changes over time, right? For a lady to walk around in Savannah tomorrow wearing a head covering, I mean, it would signal something, I guess, but it probably wouldn't signal all the things that it did in first century Corinth. People wouldn't immediately look at that and think, oh, yeah, that's a married lady, faithful to her husband. What a beautiful thing. They would think, man, why she got that towel in her head? Why is she doing that? Is she a part of some, very specific religious sect that I don't know about that's moved into town? It wouldn't signal the same thing. What are some ways that a woman in public signals that she, to use politically incorrect language, belongs to her husband, is connected to her husband, is following her husband? Okay. All right, so the way that she dresses, great. Okay. We said that maybe the fact that she wears a wedding band would be a way that she signals that. The fact that my wife's taken my last name signals a certain kind of ownership of this marriage relationship. She didn't cast that off. Say, I'm not going to take your name. I'm going to keep my dad's name. She didn't do that. Those are ways that ladies can signal that this kind of relationship that Paul is talking about here. What are ways that men might signal publicly that they are taking responsibility for their home and sacrificially loving their wives, trying to lead their homes, lead their kids? I don't know that head coverings would enter into it. Certainly dressing in a distinctively masculine way, that's a good place to start. It's probably going to be more of a behavioral sort of thing, maybe the way that you speak about your wife in a very uplifting, edifying, respectful, honoring kind of a way. Not joking about your wife, not putting her down. I mean, it's not that y'all can't joke together as long as y'all are both in on it, but men who denigrate their wives and the way they speak to them or the way they address them, that would be to completely fly in the face of what this text is teaching. I meant to say this on Sunday, and I didn't. I can't believe that I didn't say something on Sunday. I feel like I was just shooting from the hip. But Candace and I made a commitment when we got married. We were not going to speak negatively about each other to other people. We just weren't going to do that. We may need to discuss some hard things together, but when we get outside of those four walls, we are not going to be running each other down, criticizing one another, complaining about one another, not even to our parents. That's just something we were not going to do, unless we were legitimately seeking help from a mature Christian with a problem we were having. We just weren't going to do that. We're going to present a united front to the world. And by God's mercy, I think that we've both done that. And it has just paid dividends. Like, I never wonder if Candace is running me down somewhere to somebody. She never has to wonder what I'm saying about her, how I'm talking about her to somebody else. I think that's one way that we can kind of honor the spirit of this passage in the way that we are presenting ourselves and relating to our spouses or relating to other people in public. We get a bunch of things wrong, but that's one commitment that I'm thankful the Lord led us to make. Well, let's talk about hair as we get to the end. So just to cut to the chase, I don't think women have to wear head coverings to obey this passage. In fact, the women in this passage are only told to wear head coverings when they're praying and prophesying in church. So in your Sunday school class, if you voice a prayer and it makes you feel better to put a head covering on your head to honor this, then I think the Lord could be honored in that, but I don't think that you have to. I think those other principles we talked about are much more important. I think that's what really endures here in this text. What about this hair? Paul gets into at verse 14. He says, "Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it's a disgrace for him?" Okay, so here's the principle. Nature teaches basic distinctions between men and women. We know by instinct that certain behaviors are appropriate for women and not for men, and vice versa. Certain behaviors are appropriate for men and not for women. The example Paul picks that would make a lot of sense in this setting is hair length. However, I think there's some, as I've been working on this passage, just thinking about what the whole Bible teaches, there's some complications here. So we don't have a barber here ready to give crew cuts to all the men before they leave. There are plenty of manly men in the Bible who have long hair, a bunch of them, including Paul. Because when Paul was in Corinth, we know from Acts 18, he took a Nazirite vow. Y'all know what that is? That's where you make a commitment for a certain period of time that no razor shall touch your head. You won't cut your hair. Like Samson was unique in that his whole life was to be a Nazirite vow. He was never supposed to cut his hair. Samuel's mother never cut his hair, 1 Samuel chapter 1. So there are lots of very masculine and obedient men in the Bible. Samson's not so obedient, but Paul and Samuel are. Masculine and obedient men who don't cut their hair, and they've got really long hair. The issue that Paul's putting his finger on is a man presenting himself in an effeminate way. And so you can have long hair as a man and not be seeking to kind of blur the line between male and female. There are plenty of men in the Bible do that. You can have short hair and blur the line between male and female. So don't get hung up on hair length. Same thing for women. I think to try to prescribe the exact length of a woman's hair from this passage also misses the point. A woman's hair, Paul says, is part of her unique feminine glory. Her unique feminine glory. Her hair, Paul says, is like the covering over the Shekinah glory of the temple. That's a reference to Isaiah chapter 4, verse 5, where Isaiah is talking about the glory over God's temple, and he says, and over all the glory there was a covering. I think Paul's making a reference to that. A woman's hair is like this covering over this glorious person whom God has made. So hair is only one, but an important way that God made women gloriously different from men. And while the world might sometimes try to obscure or blur the differences between women and men, we should lean into those differences, and we should celebrate them. So I'm sure there are any number of ways that a lady can attractively style her hair in a way that's feminine and clearly embracing her creation as a woman by God. I don't think that we have to get out our rulers and see if everyone's at the appropriate length and all that kind of thing. I think that really does miss the point. The idea here is God has made the woman distinctively femininely glorious, and she needs to embrace that. And God's made men distinctively masculinely glorious, and he needs to embrace that. And we just want to press into what it means to be a man of God if you're a man, and a woman of God if you are a woman. And the way we present ourselves, our appearance, that's a part of that. So our public appearance communicates many important things. We want to make sure it's communicating, I belong to the Lord, I want to glorify him, I want to be obedient to him. And that's really all I have to say about that. Head coverings, hair length. I'd love to talk more about any of this with you. No one will be escorting you from the building based on your haircut, but I think there are a lot of important principles for us to consider here. Let me pray. God, in Jesus' name, we come before you, and God, we confess that when we read 1 Corinthians 11, it does seem pretty wild to us, and it does seem to be putting its finger on some very specific issues. But Lord, as we look around at our world and we see all the chaos that comes from generations and generations of really casting off what your word has said about men and women, it should sober us. And it should make us willing to go back to the source and say, okay, Lord, whatever you do say about men and women, I'm ready to hear it, and I want to receive it. And God, we want to be wise in the way that we apply this in our day today and our setting today, but we want to make sure that we are being obedient to you. We want to be everything you made us to be. We don't want to be anything you didn't make us to be. We want it to be clear by our lives, by our appearance, by our conduct, by our worship, that we are seeking to be submissive to you, because that really is the way of joy in this world. We thank you so much for your word. We thank you for our church. We thank you for one another. What a gift we all are to one another. Help us to celebrate that, to love and encourage one another.